It was just a little over 3 years ago that Hideo Kojima took the stage at E3 to announce Death Stranding, and the game's launch is now looming on the horizon. But honestly, it feels like it's been a much longer wait. The anticipation surrounding any game made by Kojima and his team has surely been a factor in making the wait unbearable, but something else that has contributed just as much, if not more, is how shrouded in mystery everything to do with this particular game has been. Up until very recently, despite numerous trailers, many of which were quite lengthy, there was so much we simply didn't know about Death Stranding, and it was that lack of even the most fundamental knowledge about the game that made the wait for it seem so excruciating. Thankfully, with its release right around the corner, recently Kojima lifted the lid on a lot of things that have given us a much clearer picture of what to expect from the game. Its central narrative premise has become much clearer now, but more importantly, we also know a lot more about its gameplay foundations. In this feature, we'll be taking a look at everything we've seen and heard of Death Stranding so far as we try and identify and examine what we think are going to be the key gameplay elements that will make up the bulk of the game's mechanical core. For the most part, we'll be talking about the recent Tokyo Game Show demonstration because most of our information comes from it, but we'll also occasionally look back at the details we've learned in the past and try to connect them to all the new things that we've learned. So, as we jump in, it makes sense to start with the thing that Kojima has been talking up more than anything else pretty much since the day Death Stranding was announced: Strand. Hideo Kojima has been insistent for some time now that Death Stranding is a completely new type of action game. It's not a stealth title, it's not your typical action-adventure experience. It is, instead, in Kojima's own words, a completely new genre. Sure, there are stealth elements and combat in there, which we'll speak about in a bit, and yes, it's an open-world game. But according to Kojima, the thing that drives Death Stranding, above all else, is something that has never been seen in games before, or at least not to this extent. He calls it the social strand system. Death Stranding isn't a multiplayer game, not in the traditional sense, but it's definitely got multiplayer in its soul. The best baseline comparison we can draw, at least based on what we've seen so far, is with Dark Souls and Bloodborne, which saw players interacting with the game itself in a solo fashion, but also being able to leave each other messages scrawled on walls or floors, providing short but helpful clues about the challenges lying ahead, or actively trying to sabotage other players depending on what kind of player you are. And sure, Soulsborne had other multiplayer mechanics as well, but it's definitely the one revolving around player communication that seems the most pertinent right now. Death Stranding is a game about connections in more ways than one. It's an underlying theme driving the central narrative premise, but it's also something that defines much of the gameplay, and it's what the social strand system is all about. It's about players doing things in their own game world while interacting with it as a single-player game, but their interactions affecting other players as well. Did you just cross a chasm by using one of your ladders as a bridge to get to the other side? Well, you can choose to leave that ladder behind for other players to use. Those players then don't have to worry about finding a way across, or about not having anything in their inventory that they could use to cross that gap. And it applies in so many other places as well. You can leave your bike behind for other players to use. You can leave behind helpful signs and vague messages to let players know that the path ahead is a rocky one and it's best traversed on foot. You can set up safe houses in the open world that other players can then use in their own games. You can even lend a helping hand to players that might be calling out for help in the middle of a boss fight by giving them resources to use. Something else that's interesting about this, and what makes it stand out as compared to other games that have done similar things, is that much of this is a collaborative effort. Kojima has demonstrated and spoken about the like system, where players can leave behind likes for helpful signposts, pathways, or other such things created by other players, which would presumably act as indicators of how helpful said things are. However, the piece of information that's even more intriguing is the fact that through collaborative action, players can actually transform the terrain of the world of Death Stranding. Say you chart a course while going from point A to B, and you leave behind things like helpful signposts and safe houses and shortcuts while you do so for other players to use. Other players make use of these things and leave you likes. Simultaneously, these other players add their own little helpful things on this path from point A to B. Eventually, through collaborative action and contribution, where there was nothing before, now there's a road. Soon, that becomes a highway. Maybe there are eventual actual proper bridges that you can use to cross chasms, rather than using ladders as makeshift bridges. And in a game that relies on traversal as much as Death Stranding does, which we'll get into in a bit, that's a huge, huge thing. To be fair, we don't actually know just how far this mechanic will go and how in-depth it will be. There are still plenty of questions we have about this. For instance, if the terrain keeps transforming, does that mean that eventually there'll be paths and highways and safe houses everywhere? And if that is the case, and there is no danger left in the world, and charting your courses and traversal and navigation aren't things that you really need to worry about anymore, doesn't traversing the open world become a bit muted? Additionally, what if someone wants to play the game completely offline? If you do play it offline without the social strand system being much of a factor, does that mean that you're getting a half-baked experience? A version of the game lacking in one of its biggest features? It's worth mentioning that Death Stranding does not require a PlayStation Plus subscription for its multiplayer features, which means you don't have to pay additional money for them. And while that certainly alleviates some of those concerns, the fact of the matter remains that some people simply don't have access to proper, if any, connections on their consoles. Be that as it may, it goes without saying that there's a lot about social strand system that we still do not know, and as the picture becomes clearer, these questions will hopefully be answered in a satisfying manner. And if they are, the strand system could be an actual game changer. The ability to transform the game's world in meaningful ways through your gameplay actions is a mouth-watering prospect, and if it's executed properly, it has the potential to be a revelation in the industry. Traversal. From what we've seen of Death Stranding so far, it's become clear that a huge, huge chunk of the game is all about traversal. Unless Hideo Kojima is pulling a classic Snake Raiden Metal Gear Solid 2 bait and switch on us once again. Sam's main mission in the game is to go from the US's East Coast to the West Coast, stopping at cities along the way and reconnecting them to the UCA's chiral network in order to make America whole again. And that central narrative premise also looks like it'll be defining much of the gameplay experience. We saw nearly 50 minutes of gameplay at TGS recently, and they were all about Sam traveling from one settlement to the other, and the actual traversal is what drove the majority of the 50 minutes. Sam has to get to, say, Port Knot City, but how does he get there? What route does he take? Where does he stop to catch his breath? What things should he take along with him that might help him on his journey? There's a lot of games that make traversal the core aspect of gameplay. Just recently, the likes of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Spider-Man did it. But while those two did so by introducing fun and innovative movement mechanics, Death Stranding seems to be going about it in a very different way, by making the actual traversal of its world a puzzle-solving exercise. There's a 3D map in the game, as we've seen, which players can use to chart proper courses. So rather than setting a destination and getting a marker that tells you how far that destination is and where you should turn next, you can decide the beginning and ending points of individual parts of that entire trek. You take a look at the environment being shown to you on your map, you take stock of what you'll have to go through, and based on that, you decide for yourself what the best route to take will be. And while you're following that route, the game throws obstacles at you. There could be chasms to cross, large cliffs to scale, huge rivers blocking your path, among other things, and it seems like Death Stranding will present players with options for how to deal with these obstacles. You can cross chasms with ladders, climb down cliffs with ropes, look for sections of the river that aren't too deep and thus easier to cross. But what if all of that doesn't work? What if your ladders or ropes aren't long enough? What if you don't have ladders or ropes? What if the river is too deep or the current too strong? Delivering cargo is your primary objective most of the time, so protecting it and making sure it doesn't get damaged is something else that you need to think about. Maybe factors like your stamina even come into play. What do you do then? Well, you find a way around, or maybe you look for safe houses or terminals in the vicinity, or try and raid enemy encampments if there are any in the vicinity, to find stuff that could help with your traversal, whether that's items or equipment, like the speed skeleton we saw at TGS that allowed Sam to jump across a huge gap, or vehicles that you might be able to hijack. And environmental obstacles aren't the only ones players will face in Death Stranding's world, either. The biggest threat in this world is, of course, the BTs, or beached things, those spectral, ghostly entities that we've seen so much of. BTs might be lying in your path, presenting even more quandaries. Should you make your way through them to save yourself some time, or just find a way around to take a longer route? How timely you are in delivering cargo is another aspect that plays into Death Stranding's missions. So do you risk getting caught by BTs and facing disastrous consequences, which we'll get into in a bit, to save some time, or would you rather take the safe approach, look for a longer route, and risk the success of your objective? Banking so hard on traversal in an open-world game can be incredibly risky, and for Death Stranding it seems doubly so. We've already seen criticisms about an empty world floating around, while Death Stranding doesn't have a unique hook to its movement the way Breath of the Wild did with its climbing paragliding loop and Spider-Man did with its web swinging. And while those are valid concerns, Death Stranding seems to be going for something very interesting. By making the simple act of traversal something that constantly has you thinking and interacting with its world, by making it the driving force behind you having to get familiar with your environments and the tools at your disposal, it can sidestep those issues. Because at the end of the day, what we want from our games is active and engrossing engagement, and traversal in Death Stranding is looking like it will offer that in spades. Survival elements. Survival mechanics are probably going to be one of the primary forms of interaction with the game in Death Stranding, and from all that we've seen so far, it looks like they'll be linked with traversal quite intrinsically. To be clear, survival mechanics in the context of Death Stranding doesn't necessarily mean traditional survival mechanics. You don't have to worry about hunger or thirst meters, for instance, but there's a lot of systems in the game that are going to need players to micromanage a lot of stuff. As we've mentioned, at its core, objectives in Death Stranding will often boil down to one very simple thing: to deliver cargo you're carrying to a specific destination. Once again, we're working on the assumption that Hideo Kojima isn't completely blindsiding us, and that the game will be completely different from what's been shown so far. That primary objective is going to play into gameplay in interesting ways, in what looks like a unique spin on things such as inventory management and encumbrance. The more Sam carries, the slower he moves, which means that before you set out on your trek to your next destination and leave your safe house, you'll have to think about what you want to carry with you. Certain cargo will be mandatory based on your quests, which means you're left with more limited space to work with. In light of that, how many ladders and anchors do you carry with you to help you with traversal and getting past environmental obstacles? Boots, it seems, are also very important, and they protect Sam's feet from the wear and tear, which would imply that walking without boots might be actively harmful. And there's durability systems in place for boots, and other items one would imagine. So how many of these items should you carry with you? You might get your hands on a bike or a floating carrier to help you carry your stuff, but you might also come across terrain or areas where those are unusable, which means you probably cannot rely on them too much either. It's clear that stamina is also something that you have to keep an eye on, and that taking breaks to rest, or take a dip in a hot spring apparently, to recharge your batteries is something else you'll have to do. When you're in the thick of it, if you carry too much, not only would your movement be hampered, but you could also run the risk of losing your balance, and if you lose your balance and say fall off a cliff, you could damage your precious cargo. And that's another thing that looks like it's going to be important: Sam's balance. Because it looks like Death Stranding is making something as simple as walking a thing that players need to actively engage with and pay attention to. When Sam heads out and decides what he'll carry with him, it's the players who decide how that stuff is physically placed on his person. You can stack all of it on his back, you can hang some of it on his sides, and you can decide how you want to stack it, and so on and so forth. And based on that, Sam's center of gravity will shift while he's walking, and shift further based on the type of terrain he's walking on. If he starts leaning too much towards one side, to make sure he doesn't tip over, players have to use the shoulder buttons to realign him. While walking, running, or sliding downhill, Sam has to maintain his balance to avoid taking a tumble. On paper, this is all the definition of dull, but when you're actually playing and actively involved in all of this stuff, it has the potential to be gripping in very realistic ways. For example, you might be walking on a ladder that's acting as a makeshift bridge across a huge chasm, and managing your balance and protecting your cargo in such a situation could be oddly thrilling. If you do indeed want to call it a walking simulator, at least it's making the walking parts much more engaging for players. There are a few other elements that we've seen in some of the game's story trailers, but haven't yet seen playing out during actual gameplay footage. One very minor example that immediately comes to mind is a scene shown in the game's E3 2018 trailer, where Sam is painfully ripping off a broken toenail. Perhaps that's something that will happen if and when players walk without boots, or with improper boots, or if players take a fall or something else. Maybe that will affect how well you can maintain your balance, or how much weight you can carry, or how long you can walk without having to take a rest. Moving beyond that, something much more major and much more interesting that we haven't quite figured out yet is timefall. The mysterious rain that rapidly fast-forwards whatever it touches is something that we can safely assume will factor into the story heavily, based on how much we've seen of it or heard about it in trailers, but will it play into gameplay as well? In the E3 2018 trailer, Fragile, played by Leah Seydoux, said something about cryptobites, insects that sort of look like leeches, keeping the timefall away, and during the TGS demonstration we saw cryptobites in the world that players could pick up. Maybe players will always need to have plenty of them on their person and pop one when the need arises to make sure that timefall does not harm you. Damaged cargo is also something that players need to avoid at all costs, so keeping it and presumably yourself away from the timefall will be a gameplay element. Perhaps players will also have to be on the lookout for incoming storms, and make sure that they get to shelter before the rain starts falling. And if, hypothetically, that does figure into gameplay, that, combined with, say, the tension of moving through an area crawling with BTs, could make for some thrilling and memorable experiences. Combat and stealth. Hideo Kojima has remained insistent for the last 3 years that Death Stranding isn't a game about combat. It's not even a game about stealth. Though it's not a game about combat and stealth, it still has them, and this is one area where things are still a little hazy as details go. The last few months is where we've gotten all of our looks at combat, and from shooting to melee to stealth, we've seen it all. We've seen Sam swing pieces of his cargo at enemies. We've seen him shooting ropes at their feet with something known as a bola gun. We've seen him shooting enemies with an assault rifle in the realm of Hades. We also know that Sam can hijack vehicles, so perhaps it'll also be possible to run people over. When it comes to human enemies, from what we've been able to gather, stealth works the way you would expect. Sam can hide in tall grasses, he can sneak up on enemies from behind and tie them up. When enemies get alerted to Sam's presence, he can try to outrun them while they try to attack him with what can only be described as electrified cattle prods, or he can try to take them head on. One would assume getting into combat would be inadvisable because that could damage your cargo, but you can get into combat if you want. Last year, around E3, Hideo Kojima said that it's possible to play Death Stranding as a shooter if you want, but it's not the ideal way to play it. Does that mean your actions during combat would have some sort of consequences? Death Stranding's main themes are, of course, about reconnecting and rebuilding a shattered world, and the game does seem to have a very non-combative central loop. So does that mean that if you decide to go ahead and be a killing machine anyway, that might lead to dire consequences? Now, this is just wild theorizing based on nothing factual, but is it possible that the enemies you kill become BTs, and that by killing humans you're not only adding to the ranks of the BTs, but also creating more areas in the game's world where BTs are present? It would certainly be an interesting mechanic, and one that would make combat scenarios in Death Stranding extremely captivating. In fact, a few months back when Sony shared new details on the game, it mentioned in as many words that killing your foe is almost never the solution, and that every death will carry a consequence. That definitely seems to be suggesting something along the lines of our hypothesis, and it's a concept that Kojima has sort of toyed with in the past as well, if you remember the river with the sorrow in Metal Gear Solid 3, where Naked Snake had to contend with the ghost of every enemy you as the player had killed throughout the game. But of course, humans are far from the biggest threat in Death Stranding. The BTs are what are threatening to destroy the entire world and drive it to mass extinction, and it's combat and stealth in these areas that looks really interesting. For starters, it seems like stealth is usually the best and maybe only way to get past BTs, at least in the real world. The robotic arm on Sam's shoulder acts as a sensor of BTs in the vicinity, and stealth in these areas is wholly dependent on it. One very interesting twist sees the sensor only making BTs visible when you're stationary, so if you begin to move, you lose sight of where they are, which should inject an extra dose of tension into what looks like already intense sequences. We've also seen combat against a huge lion-thingy monster in that mini boss fight shown off during the TGS demo, and we're assuming that thing is a kind of BT, where Sam uses hematic grenades or grenades with his blood in them. In fact, Sam uses weapons infused with his blood quite a bit, and we know he can also carry packs of his blood with him, which ties combat and the aforementioned survival mechanics together in interesting ways, at least theoretically. For example, if you draw too much blood to infuse them with your weapons, would that affect your health and stamina? Oh, and speaking of boss fights, Kojima mentioned during the TGS demonstration that there's going to be plenty of those in the game as well, so that's something else to look forward to. One final thing that we need to discuss in this particular section is the BB, the baby in a jar that Sam carries around with him at all times. What its significance is in terms of the story is something that we can do an entire dedicated feature on, but that's a can of worms we're not going to open right now. What we're more concerned with at the moment is, how does the BB figure into Death Stranding's gameplay? We know the BB is what powers the shoulder-mounted device Sam uses to sense BTs, so stealthing and avoiding BTs is wholly reliant on the BB. That's interesting because the BB is something else players have to manage in the game. As we saw in the trailer that focused on Deadman, the character played by Guillermo del Toro, BBs need to be regularly put into special pods that connect them to their womb mothers, because this is the only way to recharge them, so to speak, which would imply that that impacts their effectiveness and efficiency. We've also seen that during gameplay, BBs can become agitated at certain moments, for instance if Sam takes a tumble down a cliff or gets swept up in a river's current. When BB becomes agitated, it starts crying, at which point the player has to soothe it. This too ties into the game's survival mechanics, but could it also play into stealth? For instance, what if the BB hasn't been reconnected to its womb mother for a while, and as such is unable to help Sam sense BTs? Or what if it becomes agitated when there are human enemies nearby, and alerts them to your presence when it starts crying? Kojima is no stranger to making games with loads of interlocking mechanics, and this seems ripe for just that. No game over. This is perhaps the most intriguing and exciting thing about Death Stranding. The social strand system sounds genuinely interesting, the open world looks beautiful, and the story looks like it bears all of the hallmarks of a typical crazy Kojima roller coaster. But the fact that there are no game over screens in the game is something that can have a massive impact on its core design, and present players with something that we don't often see in this industry. In Death Stranding, death is not the end, which is fitting given all of the narrative context. When you get pulled in by BTs, you're not presented with a game over screen and forced to restart from the last checkpoint. No, instead you're pulled into an alternate dimension, or at least that's what it looks like, where you then have to fight against BTs and make it back to the real world. It was one of these fights that we saw towards the end of the TGS gameplay demonstration. Our hope is that that was one of many different kinds, and it won't just be the same enemy type over and over again. Either way, there's plenty of interesting stuff to dive into here, because what happens if you die after you've been pulled in by the BTs? What happens if you're unable to defeat that horrifying monstrosity? Well, what happens is you still go back to the real world, but are forced to live with the consequences of your failure. And what is that failure? That the area in the real world where you were before the BTs pulled you in is now a crater, which, in the game's narrative context, is called a void out. That area is destroyed, as is everything in it. Now, there are plenty of questions to be answered here, and how satisfactorily the game answers them will potentially make or break this mechanic. For starters, how widespread is this destruction? Is the entire area now a crater, or is the damage more limited? And does that mean that resources you have collected in this area are also now gone? Is your cargo also destroyed? Any roads, bridges, highways, safe houses that players worldwide may have managed to build together in this area, are those gone too? And is this something that affects the world only in your game, or does it affect other players as well? Another interesting question that arises out of this is, how dynamic are these occurrences? The idea that your gameplay actions can cause these voidouts which change the landscape is an exciting one, but what would make it even more exciting is if it could happen anywhere. So is that how it's going to work, or are there only certain areas in the game where you can encounter BTs and which, as a result, can be transformed by voidouts? When Sony revealed new details on the game around the time its release date was announced, they mentioned supernatural beings and elements that can alter the physical state of your surroundings, which definitely implies at least some level of dynamism. Moving beyond the discussion of craters and voidouts, there is one other thing that we need to talk about, one thing that we've seen brought up in Death Stranding trailers on multiple occasions: the other side. The realm of the dead, or the realm between the living and the dead. There's a million questions we can ask about this from a narrative perspective, but even from a gameplay perspective, things are a little unclear. We've seen Sam in that alternate dimension drowning in black oily liquid during the TGS demonstration. We've seen him in ethereal, ghostly versions of historic wars, and in some cutscenes, we've seen him underwater. A few shots have even shown us a beach, and that beach has been brought up a few times during conversations between characters as well. The question here is, which of those many locations is the other side? Narratively, it would make sense that the beach is the other side, because those dots are very easy to connect. From a gameplay perspective, one would think that the area where Sam fought the BT monster in the TGS demo, because after all, that's where he got pulled in from the real world. But then again, in its release date trailer, it was heavily implied that those wartime locations were the other side, or Hades, as the game calls it. So then, are they all one and the same, just different versions of the same concept? It is an alternate dimension after all, an upside-down world, so to have such contrasting locations wouldn't be that much of a stretch. Perhaps there's some dichotomy in terms of how you get there. For instance, if you get killed by human enemies, you get pulled into those wartime locations, and if you get pulled in by BTs, you land in those areas full of black, oily liquid. It just goes to show that in spite of knowing much more about Death Stranding now than we ever have, there's still a lot we don't know. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.